We can think of the global financial system as essentially a giant barter system. I mean, money's meant to solve the barter system, but because instead of, one or two underlying monies, like say gold and silver, the current system has 180 different fiat currencies, of which something like 130 of them are free floating. The other ones are pegged, but pegs can break. And so we essentially have these 180 different local monopolies on currencies. And if you're just in a certain jurisdiction, that's what you're expected to save in, that's what you're expected to spend with. And that's what holds stable value relative to, at least relative to wages and average price levels in your jurisdiction, because it's all denominated in that, and wages tend to be sticky, and certain types of pricing tend to be sticky. And the problem, of course, is that outside of say the top dozen currencies, most of them are pretty bad at holding value. Even the top 12 lose value slowly, sometimes more quickly than others, but it's a general slow loss of purchasing power. But if you're outside of those top 12, you're more likely to lose value very, very quickly. And it's sometimes those jurisdictions fall, but it's also because those core countries push chaos to the periphery, right? Because they're the ones that have to borrow in say dollars, right? So instead of issuing debt in their own currency, they're often issuing debt in a foreign currency, which introduces volatility and default risk. And so the challenge is, if I asked this question because I actually have family in Egypt, and they were looking to sell a multifamily home, and of course different participants that own parts of that home want to have different timelines for when they might deploy that into whatever they end up owning next. And so I asked the question on Twitter. I was like, if you had to sell property in a country with a currency crisis and hold that value for whatever reason for 2 years, how would you hold it? And it just showed that the nature of that question is one, a lot of people in developed markets don't think of that. And it just shows how inefficient the current system is, because some people are like, well, we'll just hold it in dollars. It's like, well, where are you going to hold the dollars, right? If you're in Egypt or you're in Argentina, where are you going to hold the dollars exactly? Are you going to hold them in your local bank where they could be confiscated? You could have a foreign bank account, but then that implies you're kind of wealthy, right? I mean, not a lot of people don't even have domestic bank accounts, let alone foreign bank accounts. You can do stable coins, but then you're relying on a foreign counterparty, which many people stable coins are a temporary answer, but it's not a perfect answer. Some people hold it in gold, physical cash dollars, but then you're literally holding like a lot of value in your apartment. You're prone to theft, prone to loss. And it just shows that, basically there's a lot of frictions around money. It should be able to store value stably, but it can't. And so I was kind of used as an example to show how in the 21st century, how basically still inefficient and unable to meet the needs of people, the global financial system still is. So approximately 50% of people in the world live in what is classified as an authoritarian country. And of course, the exact definitions can change depending on what source you're looking at, the exact threshold where they make that differentiator. Freedom House, for example, puts it in three different categories. Every country gets like a score along these different levels of freedom, and then they're broadly classified into free, partially free, or not free. And unfortunately, about half the world lives in countries that are not free or very only minimally free. And the problem there is that there's pretty arbitrary rule of law. If you do something that the government doesn't like, they can just freeze your money, confiscate your money, and there's not necessarily recourse. There's not necessarily a separate, a distinct judicial system you basically make sure that there's fair treatment for everyone, that there's rule of law. I mean, that's a hard enough concept in some of the countries with the best rule of law. It's still never perfect, but it's far more unlikely to happen in a lot of countries. And so, obviously Canada was a recent example in what is, a developed country, that there's bank freezes associated with protesting. But there's also, I mean, I've directly spoken with, for example, Nigerian protesters. They were protesting police violence in Nigeria. And many of them had their bank accounts frozen for protesting. And so that then, for example, they were turning to Bitcoin to basically still be able to collect donations and then make outlays, because they're kind of going around the banking system. I also talked to someone who worked on Alexei Navalny's team. Basically, now he's in jail, but he was Putin's opposition in Russia, basically an anti-corruption lawyer. And they would have their bank accounts frozen, and they would turn to Bitcoin again. And then the funny thing is, the government would then open their bank accounts, because they'd rather see the money flowing through there and at least see where it's going, rather than it all be over in like Bitcoin or stable coins or things like that. And so basically, in addition to the loss of purchasing power, inflation, many people in many countries struggle with banks that, can just censor them, governments that can tell the banks to censor them, difficulty making global payments. Like, let's say you work in a country in Africa and you want to do graphic design work for someone and they have trouble paying you because you're trying to get two different systems to operate. And then there's like all sorts of checks and regulations that are stopping that money flow. And there's a lot of frictions in the global financial system, both for authoritarian reasons and for inflation reasons. There's a speed mismatch between commerce and money. And so if you go back prior to the 1800s, literally for thousands of years, money and commerce moved at the same speed, which is the speed of people, which, foot, horse, ships, that's about as fast as you could move. And that include both commerce and the actual money, whether it's gold or silver coins, or even like if you had banknotes or ledgers, you still could only transport that information the same speed with which humans are moving. But starting with the telecommunication systems in the 1800s, the mid 1800s, invented the telegraph, then the telephone, and then we laid the undersea cables starting in the mid 1800s. And at that point, banks around the world could update each other's ledgers, in the same day. And so you basically had the speed of commerce could now be as quick as a phone call, which of course was then later accelerated with the internet. Let's just say even the phone call. Well, settlement of underlying assets was still moving at the speed of gold or physical banknotes. And so that allowed governments and banks a lot of arbitrage. They basically arbitrage that speed difference because they say, okay, we have to abstract gold. We have to have banknotes that are backed by gold. And then those banknotes, even though those are physical, they're tied into this ledger system. It is a global telecommunications, enhanced ledger system that can move around very quickly. And then once you centralize everything, you can just break a pen. You can rug pull people. And that's what happened. That was kind of the whole story of the 1900s, especially, the first half of the 1900s, just a series of rug pulls, no matter where you were. And so that's kind of the speed mismatch that we've been in for a while. And I think that's a big reason why we have the fiat currency system, that nothing else is really fast enough to keep up. And so gold is still useful as a savings asset, but it's not been useful as, say, a far distance payment asset. And it's just we have this kind of speed mismatch out there that allows these systems to exist, despite the fact that they just keep losing value. I found value in Bitcoin. I think the design of it's the truly decentralized one, and it's got very strong network effects. I think stablecoins are serving a purpose for people, as we just discussed. Outside of that, so I think that some of those cryptos do slow down the say adoption of things like Bitcoin and things like that, because during a bull market, anyone can create a new coin. You can divert capital for all these different things. And then in a bear market, most of them get wiped out. They give up a lot of their gains and they never really make higher highs in the next cycle. So I do think that there's a lot of dilution in that sense. But it's one of those things where, no matter how many pesos Argentina prints, that doesn't dilute the dollar, right? And so, for example, no matter how much Dogecoins exist, it doesn't dilute Bitcoin because they are different. They are fundamentally different designs, different hash rate, different node networks, different levels of ecosystem development and general seriousness. But it does divert capital, it does slow down adoption. And so that's one of the Achilles heels of say, Bitcoin and broader crypto, is that, much like how you can't really copy Wikipedia. Like you can copy all the data on Wikipedia. You can host Wikipedia on your own website, and you can have all the data. There's actually not that much data. You can fit it in a thumb drive. And then the question is, would you get traffic that Wikipedia has if you did that? Of course, the answer is no, because even though you can replicate all the text, you can't replicate all the links. You can't replicate the army of volunteer editors. But if people made 1,000 fake Wikipedias, you would divert some traffic to those, at least for a period of time. And we kind of see that cycle after cycle as the world explores this technology. And so I do think dilution is it's always an intermediate concern throughout the space.